What is love? Love is a mental disorder. Love is a form of psychosis. And today, I would like to talk about the dark side of love. Hello, everyone. My name is Joseph Suglia, S-U-G-L-I-A, and I would like to speak about the experience of love, the experience of being in love, to set up a context in which to talk about Shakespeare's play, Antony and Cleopatra. What is love? Well, first of all, love is an emotion, not merely a feeling, but an emotion. The two words don't mean the same thing. The two concepts are not identical. A feeling is a very general category, and an emotion is a specific kind of feeling, right? Emotions are solidified, they are focused, they are concentrated. So what is love? Love is the most intense emotion. It is an intense fixation on the other human being. It's interesting, isn't it, that we use this word to denote many different modes of loving. The word love could signify romantic love. It could signify the love of God. It could signify the love of one's sister or one's brother. It could signify the love of humanity, the love of one's friend, the love of one's parents. So this one word, love, l'amour, die Liebe, verbally unifies many different significations, many different connotations and denotations. But what we're going to be talking about today is not the love of God, not the love of the father, not the love of the mother, not the love of the sibling, not the love of a political leader. No, we're going to be talking about romantic love, which is distinguishable from all other modes of loving. Now, one way of understanding love is to say that it marks the passage from the indefinite article to the definite article. So when someone is in love, that person doesn't love a human being, a woman, a man, a person. No, one loves the human being. That human being becomes the only human being for the lover, as if there were no one else in the entire world. In an entire world of 7.8 billion human beings, you love one person. You singularize and particularize one human being among 7.8 billion people. What is this if not a form of madness? So love is the transition, the movement from the indefinite article, right, a or an, to the definite article, the. One loves the person, not just a person, not just one person among many. In other words, we fall in love with our own hallucinations, and we ignore the shortcomings of the other human being, the person in whom we are in love, ignoring all of the shortcomings and exaggerating the beloved's strong points, as if the beloved had nothing but strong points and no weaknesses, no flaws, no problems. And the lover, of course, mercilessly attacks anyone who would discredit the beloved, who would point out a shortcoming, who would point out a flaw or a problem in the object of one's loving. Nietzsche writes in Beyond Good and Evil, Prelude to a Philosophy of the Future, he writes in paragraph 67, love for only one person is a kind of barbarity, for it is exercised at the expense of all other people. This also includes the love for God. End of quotation. So if we singularize one human being out of 7.8 billion people, what is this if not a kind of madness? Of all the people who you could fall in love with, you fall in love with one person and believe that that one person is the only person worthy of your love. Again, what is this if not madness? It's a form of psychosis, really. Love is a form of psychosis. Now, there really are three fundamental human impulses, if you think about it. Three basic human instincts. And the first of all of these would certainly be the egoic impulse, right? The egoic impulse is the drive for self-preservation, the drive to preserve the self. That's egoic. And that could be hunger, it could be thirst, the need for clothing, the need for shelter, the need for safety, the need for freedom from pain, the avoidance of pain. All of these are egoic impulses. But there are two social impulses. The first is the nurturing impulse. We desire to nurture someone. We desire to make someone else the object of our nurturing impulses. But then there is another impulse, and that certainly is the impulse to reproduce, or, and this is another version of that, the romantic impulse or the erotic impulse, which is also a very powerful social drive. So there is one self-oriented social drive, we can call it the egoic drive, and there are two social impulses at least. The first is the romantic drive, and the second is the nurturing drive. But these two drives are not identical. Now, human beings instinctively prefer to nurture those in whom they can recognize themselves. This doesn't mean necessarily that one only wants to nurture someone who looks like the nurturer. No, not necessarily, because you can intellectualize, rationalize that nurturing impulse. In fact, it's done all the time. The nurturing impulse can be intellectualized in the way that Jesus taught. For example, if someone is going to want to nurture someone whom he or she does not immediately resemble, right? So the intellectualization of the nurturing impulse is usually what we call altruism, and it is held up as a value in most societies, in most cultures, I should say. Value is based on rarity, right? Something is considered to be a value only if it's rare and only if it's difficult, only if it's hard to achieve. This is because altruism goes against our most basic proclivity, which is to prefer the familiar seeming to the unfamiliar seeming. So love is a social instinct. This is the romantic impulse, right? Love is a social instinct that ideally leads to reciprocal determination. The beloved, the person I love, defines me in my being, and I define the lover in his or her being, or in one's being, regardless of the gender. It doesn't matter what the gender is. The sex of the beloved doesn't matter. The gender of the beloved doesn't matter. What is the difference between sex and gender? In my words, I would say sex is timeless, but gender is subject to time, right? Gender is a style. We care more about what the beloved thinks of us than we care about anything else. Why? We care about what the beloved thinks about us more than anything else because that person, the beloved, defines us in some profound manner, in some deep sense, in some profound sense. Reciprocal love means that the lover defines the beloved and the beloved defines the lover, right? We define each other in reciprocal love. I define you and you define me. But this does not mean that two lovers fuse together and harmonize into some kind of single being in the Platonic sense, right? Not at all. Not at all. It's absolute nonsense. There is no harmonization in love. And certainly if I define you and you define me, that's not a harmonious relationship. Quite the contrary. No, to a much greater extent, there is division and even antagonism in love. So I'm getting to my main argument. To quote Rilke in his somewhat overrated book, Letters to a Young Poet, lines from which are tattooed on the arms, legs, and backs and necks of countless people. This is a quote from Rilke. I quote, "For one human being to love another. That is perhaps the most difficult of all of our tasks. The ultimate, the last test and proof, the work for which all other work is but preparation. I hold this to be the highest task for a bond between people, that each protects the solitude of the other. So each human being shelters the solitude of the other person. In the love relation, he means. This is me, not Rilke. But let me go back to the text. To quote again, Rilke, this is the miracle that happens every time to those who really love. The more they give, the more they possess. Consider that. Now, the myth of love. The concept of romantic love is not timeless. It has a history, which is to say it has a beginning and it will have an end. The concept of love as we know it was not around since the beginning of humanity, since the dawn of humankind, not at all. So where does this myth come from? As far as I can tell, it comes from two primary places. First of all, it comes from the love sonnets of Petrarch, the 14th century Italian scholar and poet. Petrarch, as you might know, composed love sonnets to the unrequited lust of his life, Laura. Laura, right? He was in love with Laura and dedicated a number of poems to Laura. His concept of romantic love has been highly influential, and what we think of today as romantic love is heavily indebted to love as Petrarch understood it. Petrarch, of course, gave rise, or inaugurated, I should say, the Italian Renaissance. But also there is another source for our understanding of romantic love, and that is the 12th and 13th century Spanish and French troubadours, the troubadours who wandered around and composed and sang love poetry. Clearly, what we think of as romantic love is, again, traceable back to Petrarch and the troubadours in France and in Spain. Now, if you want to see the lineage, if you want to see the genealogy of the concept of love, listen to any number of popular songs. Well, I guess I could just end the sentence there, right? Because what are most popular songs about? You could just tell me, say it to the screen. That's right. Most popular songs are about love. Now, I know these are somewhat boomeristic references, but All You Need Is Love by the Beatles is a prayer to love. It's a hymn to love. The same thing could be said for the songs of Jackie DeShannon. She's not as well known anymore, but I'm sure you've heard her songs. What the World Needs Now is Love, Sweet Love, which was used at the very end of a really quite excellent film from 1969 called Bob and Carol and Ted and Alice, which is a film that is basically about polygamy. So I don't know, but I don't know if Jackie DeShannon was referring to monogamous love. I don't know if she was alluding to polygamous love. I don't know. But then Jackie DeShannon has another song, which is even better than that first song, called Put a Little Love in Your Heart. Unfortunately, however, these hymns to love, these prayers to love, as tuneful as they might be, misrepresent the essence of love, I would argue. Before I get into that, I have a question. Why is love a value? Why should any emotion be considered a value, right? We said earlier that values are rare, right? What determines a value is scarcity, is rarity. Now, it might be the case that love is rare, but is that why we value it? Love has been praised as a virtue, as the affirmative emotion par excellence, at least since Petrarch, and possibly even before. Indeed, it is quite possibly, along with freedom, the concept of freedom, the most dominant ideal in Western culture. But here is my question again. Is it ever logical to consider any emotion an ideal, much less a value. That's my counter argument there. But I have another counter argument for you. There is something that very few people ever speak of. This is something that is almost never addressed, and that is that love is a very dark emotion. Love impinges on darker affects. So let me discuss the darker dimensions of love, because love draws out our darker dimensions. In fact, it might even draw out our darkest dimensions, right? I freely admit that love offers some of the most exquisite delights that life has to offer. Of course it does. And a loveless life is not a life worth living. I completely concur. I completely agree with that. Love does offer some of life's greatest delights, but love can also do a number on you. Love can scuttle you. Love can destroy you. And I have a number of arguments that will support this, which is my thesis, right? Love is a mental disorder, and love is a very destructive emotion. Love can scuttle you. It can destroy you. There's a dark side of love that is seldom acknowledged and seldom addressed. Love, again, is a kind of psychosis. It is a psychological sickness, love is. Now, first of all, there's a feeling of powerlessness that overcomes and afflicts the lover. And that is a reason why lovesickness is the most devastating subjective disaster that any human being can go through. Unreciprocated love, right, is a viciously catastrophic abyss. Think about the viciously catastrophic abysses of unreciprocated love. Everyone has experienced that, and if you haven't, don't worry, you will, and it will be nightmarish. It will be painful, excruciating painful. Why is it that thoughts of murder and suicide are seldom absent from the mind of an unreciprocated lover, right? I'm not talking about reciprocated love right now. I will. But I'm talking about unreciprocated love. Why is it that the unreciprocated lover so often has thoughts of murder and suicide? We don't want to admit this. We don't want to acknowledge it, but it's true. Now, I could give you many examples of how unrequited love often leads to thoughts of murder, homicide, and suicide. How the throes of love often end in death, whether suicide or parasuicide, right? The uncompleted suicide attempt in which the aim is not death, but that nonetheless results in death very often. And there are so many anecdotes that I can tell you. But after, and one could argue, well, this is just anecdotal evidence, but after multiple anecdotes are told, evidence ceases to be anecdotal. It is no longer anecdotal after a number of anecdotes are told. We can leave that aside. Why don't we just talk about science then? There are neurophysiological reasons for the link between suicidality and unrequited love, right? The experience of love leads to what psychologists call limerence. That's Limerence, limerence. Limerence refers to the obsessive thoughts that plague incessantly the mind of the lover. Love, again, is a kind of obsessive fascination with one human being as opposed to 7.8 billion other human beings. Even worse, romantic love suppresses the serotonin in the lover's body, right? Let me return to that earlier point, though. And this is something that comes from Nietzsche. Like, instead of giving our love, instead of donating our love to the whole of humankind, instead of loving all of humankind, we choose one human being and we squander all of our love on one human being as opposed to the countless others we could love. That is madness. But let me get back to this. Love suppresses the serotonin in the lover's body. The serotonin levels of the lover plummet. Now, why is serotonin helpful? Serotonin is helpful for sleep. It's the chemical precursor of sleep. serotonin is converted by your brain into melatonin, which helps you fall asleep at night or during the day, in the day. Lovers traditionally have very low, catastrophically low levels of serotonin. And because they have such low levels of serotonin, they have low levels of melatonin. Again, serotonin is the chemical predecessor of melatonin, which is why most lovers suffer from insomnia. They suffer from other things too, as we will see. Moreover, low levels of serotonin make you irritable, irascible, querulous, peevish, right? Low serotonin tires you out, fatigues you, exhausts you. And low serotonin often leads to appetite withdrawal. Now, if you've ever been in love, and I think just about everyone has been, or will be soon enough, sooner or later, you know that it's often difficult to eat. So when you're in the throes of love, you can't sleep, you have no urge to eat, and you are beleaguered by insistent, unwanted thoughts of the beloved. Now, I use the word beleaguered, right? Besieged, oppressed. There's a reason why I use that word. This is what the word obsession means. The word obsession comes from the Latin verb obsidere, and obsidere means to besiege, to beleaguer, to burden, to impose upon someone, right? But there's something that's even more frightening than that, which we must talk about now. Most frighteningly, some neuroscientists have concluded that serotonin deficiency can lead to suicidal ideation. I'm going to post a link to that study in the description below this video. This doesn't come from me. This is something I read in a scientific journal. The link is below. The entire world already knows this already, I think, but very few people have been able to admit this aloud. Yes, unrequited love can lead the unrequited lover to ponder suicide. And even more disturbingly, or no, really just as disturbingly, I guess, violence against other human beings. And that unfortunately is all too common, which is another possible consequence of serotonin abnormality. Again, the relevant link to the relevant journal is below this video in the description on YouTube. So there is scientific evidence to back up the claim that there is a narcoticizing essence of love, that love has a narcoticizing essence. Now, one of the things that Nietzsche has taught us in Also sprach Zarathustra is that love is always the desire for possession, for appropriation, for assimilation, right? Romantic love, for this reason, is always accompanied by jealousy. There can be no love without jealousy, always, necessarily. Now, someone might say to me, well, I have a partner, but I'm not jealous of him or her. Well, then I'm sorry, you're not in love. You're not in love with that person. You're not in love with your partner then. I'm sorry to break it to you. It is possible to be jealous of the love interest of someone you're not attracted to, right? So in other words, there might be someone in your life and you don't find that person attractive, but you're jealous of the attention that that person gets, right? That doesn't mean you're in love with that person. No, it just means this. It's possible to be jealous and not to be in love, sure, but there can be no love without jealousy. So if you feel no jealousy for those who amorously surround the supposed object of your affection, then you are only lovelessly related to that person, right? Love, again, is the desire for ownership, appropriation. Love is an assimilatory impulse, which is why it is always necessarily accompanied by jealousy. It has to be. Otherwise, it is not love. It is not love if there is no jealousy. And when the desire for possession is slaked, the lover ceases to desire the beloved. Everyone knows this, right? In other words, reciprocal love easily becomes boringly disappointing. Now, Nietzsche, also in Beyond Good and Evil, Prelude to a Philosophy of the Future, writes in paragraph 102, I quote, "The discovery of mutual love should really make the lover sober about the beloved. How is this possible? The person you love is unpresumptuous enough to love even you? Or stupid enough? Or you see what Nietzsche is getting at here? The other thing to consider is that love and hatred really do go together, and this is where language is deceptive. Language is seductive. Language deceives. Because we use this word love, and then we have another word that we call hatred, right? Love and hatred. No, love and hatred really form one emotional complex. Love and hatred are intermeshed. They are intermingled into a single affective complex. Language simplifies things. We use these words as if we're talking about two different things. No, love very often, if not always, is entangled with hatred. Is hatred always entangled with love? Not always, but often enough it is. So this book is Conversations with Kafka by Gustav Januk. Now, some claim that this book is apocryphal. I choose to believe in it. This is essentially a record of a series of conversations that a young man named Gustav Januk had with Kafka. And the reason why I believe that this is an accurate record is that the conversations sound like they were had with Kafka. Kafka sounds like the interlocutor. There's no way of simulating Kafka's voice. There's no way of doing it. And to do so, I believe, would have surpassed Januk's powers of invention. But let me read this passage, because Kafka spoke about love and its relationship with dirt, filth. What is the relationship between love and filth? And we're not to think of filth in the sense of, what is obscene. No. This is what Kafka said to Januk about love and filth. Love always inflicts wounds which never heal, because love always appears hand in hand with filth, said Kafka. Only the will of the loved one can divide the love from the filth. But someone as helpless as your young friend, this is Januk's young friend, who is in love, has no will of his own, and so he is infected by the filth. He is a victim to the bewilderment of adolescence. He is a victim to the bewilderment of adolescence. Such things can cause grave damage. A man's embittered features are often only the petrified bewilderment of a boy. So in other words, when you see a man and his face seems scarified and just worn, it's as if he's been traumatized. That could be the repercussion of a love affair that he had when he was a boy. Notice how Kafka talks about how love is excruciatingly painful. Love always inflicts wounds which never heal, because love always appears hand in hand with filth. And perhaps because love is conjoined so intimately with filth, that's why it leaves such an indelible impression on our unconscious mind. Think about it. I don't know how well you can see this because it's rather bright, but this is Charles Baudelaire's book, Intimate Journals, or these are the Intimate Journals in English of Charles Baudelaire. And this is what Baudelaire writes about love. I believe I have already set down in my notes that love greatly resembles an application of torture or a surgical operation, or a surgical operation. But this idea can be developed, and in the most ironic manner. For even when two lovers love passionately and are full of mutual desire, one of the two will always be cooler or less self-abandoned than the other. He or she is the surgeon or executioner, the other the patient or victim. Now, what does Baudelaire mean by that? Well, there is in love one partner who is absolutely passive, and the other is absolutely dominant, absolutely aggressive. This same zero-sum relation is present everywhere in love. So the lover exists in a state of one-sided dependency on the beloved. Who has more power in this relationship? The one who has less love in his or her heart for the other person. That is the person who wins. The one who loses is the one who is deeply in love. So love is a kind of enslavement. That's what Baudelaire means. The one who is loveless, comparatively speaking, has the more power. If you are in love with someone, you are enslaved to that person. That is what Baudelaire is suggesting. And love means, in other words, the loss of independence, the loss of autonomy. The one who is needed has power, or has more power, not the needful, right? Now, Bataille, Georges Bataille, has some very disturbing thoughts about the essence of love in a book that's sometimes translated as Death and Sensuality. Now, the French title is much closer to erotism. One thing about sensuality, the word sensuality, if you look at it, sensuality contains the word sense, right? Sense. Doesn't this tell us something about sensuality? That there is sense in sensuality? That there is a logic to sensuality? Now, I'm going to be reading for you a number of passages from Bataille. So let me read a few passages from Death and Sensuality by Georges Bataille. The whole business of eroticism is to strike to the inmost core of the living being so that the heart stands still. The transition from the normal state to that of erotic desire presupposes a partial dissolution of the person as he or she exists in the realm of discontinuity, right? Love leads to the destruction of one's self-possessedness, right? Love, this is me now. Love leads to the destruction of one's self-mastery. And this is the coextensivity, the coterminousness between love and death, right? Love is death, and death is love. In love, as in death, we have the experience of a non-experience, right? We are overcome by something that is infinitely greater than us, in love and also in death. And in love and in death, there is the radical destruction of the ego, of self-consciousness, right? But let's move on, because there are other passages here that I could quote as well. Physical eroticism has, in any case, a heavy, sinister quality. It holds on to the separateness of the individual in a rather selfish and cynical fashion. Emotional eroticism is less constrained. Although it may appear detached from material sensuality, it often derives from it, being merely an aspect made stable by the reciprocal affection of the lovers. It can be divorced from physical eroticism entirely. For the enormous diversity of humankind is bound to certain exceptions of this sort. The fusion of lovers' bodies persists on the spiritual plane because of the passion they feel, or else this passion is the prelude to physical fusion. For the man or woman in love, however, the fervor of love may be felt more violently than physical desire is. We ought never to forget that in spite of the bliss love promises, its first effect is one of turmoil and distress. Let me read that again. We ought never to forget that in spite of the bliss love promises, its first effect is one of turmoil and distress. Passion fulfilled, itself provokes such violent agitation that the happiness involved, before being a happiness to be enjoyed, is so great as to be more like its opposite, suffering. The likelihood of suffering is all the greater since suffering alone reveals the total significance of the beloved object. Possession of the beloved object does not imply death, but the idea of death is linked with the urge to possess. I will return to this later. I will return to this later. Let me return to that point later. Does true love exist? Well, first of all, what does that mean, true love? I suppose that true love means entirely reciprocal love. Love that is entirely symmetrical. But as we've already discussed, love is by its very nature asymmetrical or dissymmetrical. This is probably why La Rochefoucauld, not Michel Foucault, but La Rochefoucauld, did not believe that true love existed. He wrote, "People would never fall in love if they hadn't heard love talked about." Now, by love, La Rochefoucauld means so-called true love, right? Symmetrical love, which does not exist, which is equated to symmetry, right? Which, like ghosts, many have spoken about, but no one has ever actually seen. Something else to bring up, this comes from Roland Barthes. In an interview, Roland Barthes pointed out that lovers are always outsiders. And this is one of the dangers of erotomania. Erotomania is love obsession. One of the dangers of erotomania is that lovers are necessarily outsiders, always. The lover is the outsider on the fringes of society, the margins of society. This is not a common affect. This is not a common emotion. That doesn't mean it's a value, though. Remember what I said earlier. It's true that all values are rare, but not everything that is rare is a value. So we have to be careful. You know, this is not the law of the excluded middle. The lover is an outsider on the margins of society because being in love is a rare subjective condition. Lovers, for this reason, appear wild, untrammeled, as if they had never been socialized. And if you've met someone in love, you know exactly what I am alluding to. Now, love as a kind of madness has been a constant subject in the history of literature in the West. We can look at Goethe, for example. We can look at Shakespeare. And this is the beginning of my lecture series on Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra. Let me give you my name because I don't think I gave it just yet. Maybe I did. I don't remember. Let me just give it again. I actually think I did. Joseph Suglia, Suglia. And this is the beginning of my lecture series on Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra. Western literature has often concerned itself with the dark side, the darkest side of love. Now, so the link between love and death is a constant subject in the history of literature. Consider, for example, Goethe's early novel, Die Leiden des jungen Werthers, the sorrows of young Werther. Now, Werther is a 24-year-old man who falls breathlessly in love with an inaccessible woman named Charlotte. And then, finally, shoots himself through the brain because he cannot have her. There's even a syndrome named after this novel called the Werther effect, the Werther syndrome, I think it is in English, right? Where, well, some people copy suicides. It's quite sad, actually. It's extremely sad. But let's talk about Shakespeare now. Now, if you have read the most excellent and lamentable tragedy of Romeo and Juliet, and many people have, I hope, you know that Juliet is put into a coma and laid out in a tomb by the supremely idiotic Friar Lawrence in the play, so that she can escape marriage to the repellent Count Paris. Romeo finds Juliet comatose in the tomb and mistakenly assumes that she is dead. And what does he do? He commits suicide. The message that would have informed him of the friar's ill-advised stratagem arrives too late. Juliet awakens and discovers Romeo's body and dispatches herself in the vault, sadly. Much in the way that Isolde does after discovering the corpse of Tristan. Now, there are those who would see Shakespeare's great play as a hymn to love, as a prayer to love, in the way that those rather silly songs are said to be. Romeo and Juliet, the most excellent and lamentable tragedy of Romeo and Juliet, and the tragedy of Antony and Cleopatra are not prayers to love. They are not hymns to love. No, they are critiques in dramatic form of love. They are warnings about the dangers of love, about the destructive essence of love. This is my whole argument, basically. And I'm going to substantiate this argument over the course of many videos. But let me say that something very similar happens in Antony and Cleopatra. As if all of Shakespeare's plays, or these two plays by Shakespeare, were suggesting to us that the end of all erotic desire is misinterpretation and death. Now, as we shall see, Cleopatra dies from the bite of the venomous asp. Now, what is interesting about this death is that it's a self-inflicted envenoming. So it's a kind of self-envenoming. Cleopatra envenoms herself. It's not as if the serpent slithers along and bites her ankle and her body is suffused with venom and she passes away. No, that's not what happens. That's not what happens at all. Also, we have a delayed message or delayed messages in Antony and Cleopatra as well. In Antony and Cleopatra, we also have messages that do not arrive on time, which might be read as an allegory of language, as a comment on the delay of meaning. Messages are always late. Messages are never on time. Maybe this says something about the essence of communication. Maybe this says something about the essence of language. Post-structuralists would argue that the signified is never contained within the signifier, that the signified forever comes after the signifier. So, but I don't want to go down that path of reflection. I really want to stick with love. I want to talk about romantic desire. So Antony is so besotted, is so intensely amorous of Cleopatra that he turns his back on Rome and migrates to Alexandria, which is kind of like the unmapped region of Rome and a few other dominions as well. He then expropriates territories that were held by the Roman Empire and donates these territories to Cleopatra's sons. These are called the donations of Alexandria. So understand what this means. Antony is still married to Octavia, Octavia the Younger. He falls in love with Cleopatra, who's the pharaoh queen of Egypt, And essentially, he gives away all that he has to her. Most scandalously, he gives the title of honor to Caesarion, the notorious Caesarion, the illegitimate son of Julius Caesar and Cleopatra. All right, then. Caesarion would then become the future emperor of Rome, and this does not go over well. This does not go over well at all. This causes a massive political conflict, which leads inexorably to war. So let me go over this because this is important for an understanding of the play. Mark Antony, Marcus Antonius, commits treason against his homeland, gives away Roman territories to the children of his lover, to his Egyptian lover, while he is still married to Octavia. And these, again, are known as the donations of Alexandria. Now, I can't help but make a contemporary parallel. It's hard to believe that this happened 11 years ago. Some of you might remember what Mark Sanford did. Mark Sanford, the governor of South Carolina. Well, in 2009, something remarkable happened to the state of South Carolina. And what was that? Governor Mark Sanford vanished from the state that he was elected to govern. He disappeared. No one knew where he was. Well, I'm sure his bodyguards knew where he was, and maybe some staff knew where he was, but where was he? And where was he? Well, he was spending his days with a woman who was not his wife, by the name of Maria Belen Shapur, who is an Argentinian journalist. And he was spending his time with this journalist in Argentina. So I guess what I'm trying to say is this. Antony and Cleopatra, which is what this entire video series is dedicated to analyzing, Antony and Cleopatra is hardly a prayer to love, hardly a hymn to love, as the songs of the Beatles are. A more accurate song on the subject of love would be Love is the Drug by Roxy Music.